now that we've written down a model of how we think consumers make decisions, and we've worried really hard about trying to estimate the effect of Twitter word of mouth separately from other sources of word of mouth, be that offline kind of information or other kind of quality metrics. What we do is we estimate those parameters, and then we say what we're really interested in might not be those parameters, but how those parameters ultimately influence choice. So we compute what's called the demand elasticity. Essentially, what we're trying to capture is what's, for a 1% change in the variable we care about, how does that translate into a percentage change in demand or market share for that movie? And the results are kind of here in table 1, kind of averaging across all films. And what we find, I think, is kind of nice in that, let me highlight the main results for you. When we think about pre-release word of mouth in terms of the volume of tweets, what we find is this number here, 0.06. So if you literally read that off, that says a 1% increase in demand in the volume of pre-release tweets leads to an 0.06% increase in demand. That's quite small. Magnify it up, try and understand it better. A 10% increase in the volume of pre-release tweets increases demand by 0.6 of 1%. That's quite small, right? It's significant, but small effects of volume on demand. We do the same thing for post-release. And the variable we care about here really is this one, the effect of post-release volume on post-release demand. Find a similar effect. A 10% increase in post-release tweets translates into an 0.8% increase in demand. Again, statistically, it's going to be significant, but they're small effects of word of mouth on demand. They're not these massive size effects that one might believe, having not kind of thought through the kind of potential confounding factors. And this is why I'm actually talking about my paper here, as opposed to some other of the many choices in the literature. What they find, if you look at other papers in the literature, are really quite large effects of word of mouth, right? Like 10 times the size of what I find. And a lot of that, we think, and we kind of, when we thought through it in a really structured way, and we can actually show it to be true, is that when other papers are thinking using observational, so no experiments, just observational data about word of mouth, is online word of mouth, is they kind of contaminate kind of online word of mouth with all this other kind of offline or other sources of information that are really hard to control for, but we spend a lot of time thinking about and gathering data on to kind of pull out to say really what we have left is online word of mouth. Looking at some other results that we find that post-release sentiment, so how positive or negative conversation is after a movie's released, has an 0.27 demand elasticity. So technically, the way we model this is that if you get a 1% surprise in the quality of the movie compared to pre-release sentiment, so if you get a positive shock to demand, so it's better than, to sentiment, so it's better than we thought it was, you get a 0.27% increase in demand. Again, magnify it up, try and make sense of it. 1% is hard to deal with. 10% increase in post-release sentiment compared to pre-release. So give me a 10% surprise in movie quality compared to what I thought it was going to be. I get a 2.7% increase in demand on average. Again, not a huge effect, right? 10% change, only 2.7% translation onto demand. So then we also have these effects for advertising. I'm not going to focus on them, and we don't really focus on them too much in the paper either, But the idea was if we could get the effect of advertising on demand to look similar to state-of-the-art estimates, we think we've done an okay job at dealing with kind of any issues in kind of advertising contaminating our estimates, and we do. So I'm just going to say, we get good numbers for advertising that look like other people's. So we're not worried about advertising contaminating what we're doing in our paper. This other column over here, we tried to translate those demand elasticities another way to make them, another way to digest them. And number here, like 5.44, is something like, what's the percentage change in market share if I could increase the amount of pre-release volume by 0.5 of a standard deviation? So we compute the standard deviation of pre-release volume, and we say, suppose we could give a movie 0.5 of that extra volume. What does it do to demand? We find that for pre-release volume, for example, it gives you a 5.5% increase in demand. Not big. The standard deviation is quite large. So 0.5% standard deviation is a big shock to Twitter volume. And again, small effect on demand. It's there, it's significant, it's just small. Okay, so that are kind of the main results in this paper to an extent, that there's small but significant effects on demand, similar to what Stefan Seiler and friends found, small effects. Our effects are a bit larger than his. So his are like, 2%, ours are 6-ish, I think. But they're small, right? So it's consistent, small effects of word of mouth on demand. Then what we do is I'm like, okay, the effects are small, right, on average, but maybe it affects different kinds of products. So for me, that's different kinds of movies differently. And the main results we want to highlight here are that for example, franchise movies, so sequels and like James Bond and things like that, there's a big jump compared to the previous number in pre-release volume. So it goes up from being 0.06, so it triples, right, to 0.17. So now you get a 10% increase in volume for like Jurassic Park or the Avengers, and you get a 1.7, so almost 2% increase in demand. So for these franchise movies, what we highlight is that the effect of volume in the pre-release phase is larger for you, right? And we think that's really this idea of buzz in the kind of online sphere, because people are really excited and anticipating this movie coming out. We think everyone's aware of these, so we don't think it's awareness. We think it's really buzz. People are excited. People go and they see the movie, right? In the and they go and see it on the opening weekend. And there is some spillover to the post-opening phase, but it doesn't look that much different than the average movie if you compare to our previous estimates. For non-franchise movies, really what we're interested in here is the effect of post-release sentiment and post-release volume, where the effects seem to be large and significant compared to previous. So for non-franchise movies, post-release sentiment with 0.71 is your demand elasticity. So there's a 10% increase in sentiment compared to pre-release. So a positive jump in kind of quality, a positive change in quality perceptions, like 10%, gives you a 7% increase in market share. That's quite large, right? So for non-franchise movies, consumers really valuing what they get online. If movies are better than expected, people will then turn out and see them, but they turn out and see them not on the opening weekend. They could come out and see them on weekends 2 and 3 because they needed time to kind of get that update when the movie's better than expected. And we also find that volume in the post-release phase matters for these non-franchise movies. And we find that a 10% increase in post-release volume gives you a 2% increase in market share. So that's also quite large, right? So again, post-release volume giving you something here. We don't think this is a buzz thing. What we think here, this is really might be an awareness thing. So this is the idea maybe that for non-franchise movies, people might be less aware that they're coming out. So if we start to see discussion about a movie kind of hanging on for like past the opening weekend, we become kind of aware that it's there, or more aware that it's there, and we're then more likely to go and see it in weekends 2 and 3. That's the kind of story we have in mind, these kind of different effects for different kinds of film. The last effect that we find is we then split it down kind of further into kind of big, medium, and small movies to see what what can we see. And we see that for these large movies, these pre-release volume elasticities are really large again. So again, for these big movies, these include sequels, and some other movies like The Martian, not a sequel. People were really excited to go and see it. Has a big impact on demand. Now that sentiment and kind of that post-release sentiment and that post-release awareness idea that we had before, where we find that to really, really be different is that it's it's kind of movies that were maybe not expected to be so big. That's where post-release sentiment matters. And it's for those medium tier movies where that post-release volume matters. So for non-franchise movies, there was this sentiment effect, this post-release sentiment effect, and there was this post-release volume effect. And these affect different kinds of movies. The volume effect goes into these medium movies, whereas the sentiment, kind of post-release sentiment, goes into the really small movies, where it was really hard. So for these small movies, think of it as just really hard to have any idea before it was released if it was good or not. Somehow we formed some expectation, and then we got a positive shock. And that's what's driving our kind of decision to go and see that movie in subsequent weekends.